28 years later is finally here, and we've seen that Britain is just as ravaged by the virus as what it was a mere 28 days after it broke out. Mutations have occurred, behaviours in the infected have changed, and this tiny little island that was connected to the mainland, which was only accessible on low tide, was a small community that showed that survival was something that was a possibility, even if it meant a lack of progression. Even though this movie felt on a completely different scale of a budget to the original one, what this one did so well that the first one did was that it had deeper themes within it that showed the struggles of finding a new way of life, the idea that you had to let go of the old one, the beauty that can be found in new life, the power of loving and also accepting death. So with that, let's dive into this video and break down 28 years later. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The ending explained. Right at the end, we saw that Spike and his mother Isla managed to find Dr. Kelson, the man that was deemed to be a lunatic by Spike's father, and what we saw was that Spike's mother's confusion was coming from the fact that she had cancer. But in this post-apocalyptic world that had been sent back to the medieval ages due to the lack of technology, she was unable to be given any form of pain relief or a chance of fighting back. This led Dr. Kelson to instead kill her and put her out of the pain that would soon be on the horizon and the debilitating nature of it. With this, Spike realized that without his mother, there was nobody on the island that he thought was worth going back for. As he said himself, he believed that everybody on that island was a liar, lying to him about the world before and lying to him about what was actually out there in the world. When Spike first touched the mainland in the movie, he asked his father how far it went and if there was a point where he could walk to where he'd no longer be able to see the sea. And this is exactly what we saw him doing in the closing moments. With his mother in his heart and his father's teaching of how to be a fighter in his head, he took it upon himself to venture forward deeper inland with the hopes of finding a greater purpose and a different way of living. A way that was greater than what the island had to offer. The short scenes where the children were being taught the different roles that they'd play in society and within the community was something that didn't appeal to Spike in the slightest, because he knew that it wasn't an existence worth living. He also knew that there was an entire country that was out there, communities and knowledge that was also there, and that was something that appealed to him, hence why he wrote his father a letter saying that he'd return when he was ready. As he was sitting there eating a fish, an infected came running towards him, which he killed. But as he started to run away, more and more started heading towards him. When he reached a blockade in the road, a blonde-haired man with a crucifix that was upside down appeared and asked Spike if he and his friends could interfere. This was a tie-back to the beginning of the movie, where Jimmy, the young boy whose father was a priest that became infected during the outbreak and told him to keep the crucifix with him throughout his life, managed to survive and he made it into adulthood. It also seemed like he was this leader of a cult too. With him wearing the crucifix upside down, it seems like he'd lost all belief in God. As, after all, if there was a God, why would he inflict so much suffering onto all of those people? With the way that they killed one of the infected by hanging them upside down, it was reminiscent of the scene that was in the barn during the beginning when Spike first explored. So it seems like they've narrowly missed each other in the past before. With Jimmy and Spike introducing themselves to each other, it seems like Spike is going to get his first taste of what mainland life is like by joining Sir Jimmy Crystal's cult. Something that could be dangerous for the young lad, as it seems like he doesn't kill to survive, he kills for fun. The deeper meaning of the movie. The key themes that were explored within this movie were the ideas of loss, love, hope, and the prospect of moving on in a world that was doing its best to make you stay exactly where you were. With 28 years passing since the outbreak of the rage virus, we saw that the infected had mutated to the point where they weren't just necessarily these beings that were filled with rage and killing. They almost had a higher brain function to what they had before. There was a sense of community, there was a leader, they were bathing, and they were also multiplying, showing that they'd developed drastically over the course of the 3 decades. They mirrored the primal behaviors of humans in wanting community and togetherness, and it even seemed like the Alpha had the ability to mourn when he saw the lady on the train had died, so the gap between the two species had become smaller. And then when you flip it to the side of humankind, we saw those exact things, but we also saw elements of rage within them as well, showing that even though it wasn't the main feature of the human personality, it still lied within the mind. So I feel like it was showing how the infected and the non-infected weren't as far removed as they once originally were. We also saw examples of this when Spike didn't want his father to kill the young infected in the woods because it resembled a young child. Loss and love were also two major points in this movie, and this was served to us through the use of Isla and Spike. Spike quite literally risked everything that he could to find out what was wrong with his mother and why it was that she was losing her memory. With the lack of a doctor on the island that he was from, it meant that nobody knew what was wrong with her. So with him venturing to find the doctor, he ultimately determined that she had cancer and that she was soon gonna die. Dr. Kelson's character was particularly interesting because from the outside he was perceived to be this deranged man that had a mass grave on his land. But in actual fact, he was making sure that the dead had the ability to be remembered. Even in a world that was plagued with death, he felt as though each individual person still deserved to be remembered. Memento mori, which meant remember you must die in Latin, was a phrase that he spoke to Spike, which to me I interpreted as a way of him essentially saying that no matter what you do, the same fate meets everybody, so it's what you do with your time that matters. But with him also contrasting it with memento amoris when talking about his mother, which means remember the beloved and remember to love. It almost shone a light on the fact that it was something that was important because that was the separation from themselves and the infected at that point. Another key thing that I felt was at the heart of this movie was how the people of the world were still mourning the place that they left almost 30 years ago, and there was no real sign of progression. They were looking back at how things were, stuck in a time of before, rather than looking for ways of developing and progressing. However, the new generation, the likes of Spike, didn't have any idea of what the time before was because he wasn't alive back then, not even knowing what a delivery driver was, what the internet was, or even a phone. This difference in mindset is why I feel he was more inclined to go off and see what was actually out there, because all he'd known was the small island that was surrounded by sea. There were a lot of scenes that were intercut with medieval battles that were taking place, and it felt like it was all about showing us that this was the era that humankind had been taken back to, while the rest of the world outside of Britain had been progressing. But I also feel like it was showing us how the people on that island were stuck like that. We saw that the likes of Dr. Kelson had medicines and had worked on different ways to use iodine to make the infected stay away from him and also send them to sleep. So there was knowledge that was out there in other communities, it just required people to come together. The shut-off island were reserved, and it makes sense as to why, but I feel it was definitely showing that it was holding them back. Isla was the perfect example of the mindset and core theme of the movie because her mind was stuck in the past because she was confused and simply didn't know what time she was in. Her mind represented the entirety of that small population on the island, and I feel her death was almost symbolic of that mental state being destroyed, hence why Spike went off to see what else was out there. My review of 28 Years Later. Was 28 Years Later worth the wait and probably the hours worth of trailer watch time that I saw when watching other movies? Yeah, it was. I thought it was a great addition to the two movies that came before it, and even though Boyle and Garland decided to gloss over the fact that there was a boy that held a cure in the second movie and mainland Europe managed to eradicate the virus once it spread there, I can look past it if it means we get two more movies just like this one. One thing that I loved about this movie was the way that even though this was so much glossier than 28 Days Later, it was shot so much nicer, and not in 480p, they still adopted some of the camera movements and harsh cuts in the edit that allowed it to stay true to its roots when the infected were close by, and it brought that sense of terror from the original movie right into this one, so I thought it was a nice touch. In terms of the story, I thought it was a really well told story and it was so easy to follow. Seeing Spike with his mother and father and the two different lessons that he was learning from each of them whilst navigating this hostile world, one that inflicted fear into everybody, was just an enjoyable ride to be a part of. I thought it was smart of Boyle and Garland to highlight the fact that the virus had mutated and the infected had developed. The alphas were genuinely menacing and the little fat worm type ones were just funny to watch, to be honest. This is the best that the infected have ever looked in one of these movies, so I was really impressed with it. When I first saw that Ralph Fiennes was cast in this movie, I was certain that he was going to be a character that was just like Major Henry West and he'd be this hidden villain, but obviously he didn't turn out to be. And to be honest, I was a bit gutted by that. However, there was definitely a creepy edge to him, so that definitely carried through. I just hope we get to see him again. As per usual with these movies, the infected don't dominate the screen time, and it doesn't feel like your traditional zombie disaster movie. It feels like the idea of the infected in this post-apocalyptic world is used as a vessel to present us with thought-provoking ideas. I'd probably say that this is the least jump scare filled out of them all, and there wasn't really a moment where I jumped out of my seat, but I'd also say the others weren't really that either. Even though this is the first of an entire trilogy of films, and the ending set it up perfectly, what I will say is that Boyle and Garland did a great job at allowing this movie to feel like its own entity and wrapping up the story in a way that made it feel complete, rather than it having the plot seep into the next movie. What I will say is go and give this movie a watch, it's definitely worth it. If you enjoyed the original, it's definitely the most similar to that one. So, there you have it, a review of 28 Years Later and the ending explained.